They called me the quiet one, even before the war, even before the Germans came and turned our world into something unrecognizable. The other sisters always said that about me. Sister Agnieszka, the quiet one, the one who never raised her voice, never demanded anything, never took up more space than she absolutely needed. I used to think that was a weakness. I spent years asking God to make me bolder, braver, more present in the world. I had no idea that my silence would one day become the most powerful weapon I possessed. I had no idea that learning to disappear would be the thing that kept me alive for two of the longest, darkest, most terrifying years of my life. Lived not in a cell, not in a prison, not in a forest, but inside the very walls of my own convent, surrounded on all sides by the men who had stolen it from us. Let me take you back to the autumn of 1942. I was 38 years old, and I had been a nun for 14 years. The convent of St. Hildegard in the small town of Grudziadz in occupied Poland had been my entire world. I knew every stone in its walls, every creak in its floorboards, every draft that crept under the chapel door in winter. I had prayed in that chapel 10,000 times. I had scrubbed those kitchen floors until my knees bled. I had buried sisters I loved in the small garden cemetery behind the eastern wall. That convent was not just where I lived, it was who I was. When the SS came in October of 1942, they came without warning. They always did. I remember the sound of their trucks before I saw them, that deep mechanical growl that had become the sound of dread across all of occupied Poland. There were 12 of them that first day, officers and enlisted men, and they stood in our courtyard with their hands on their rifles and told us, in flat, bored voices, as though they were announcing a change in the weather, that the convent was being requisitioned as a communications and administrative outpost. We had 48 hours to vacate. The Mother Superior, Sister Benedicta, a woman of 71 who had survived 2 world wars and the deaths of more people she loved than I could count, stood very straight and told the commanding officer that this was a house of God. He looked at her the way men look at things they have already decided are irrelevant, and he told her that God's property was now Reich property, and that we were to be gone by Friday morning. Most of the sisters left. There were 23 of us, and 18 of them gathered what they could carry and dispersed to relatives, to other convents, to the underground networks that were quietly moving vulnerable people out of harm's way. I watched them go from the upstairs corridor window. Sister Benedicta was among them, pressed into the back of a farmer's cart, her hands folded in her lap, her lips moving in prayer. She looked up at the window as the cart pulled away. Our eyes met. I raised my hand. She shook her head, just slightly, and then she was gone. 4 of us stayed, not because we were brave. I want to be very clear about that. I stayed because I could not make myself leave. Something in me went absolutely still when I thought about walking through that gate and abandoning the convent to those men. I thought about the chapel. I thought about the garden cemetery where Sister Walburga and Sister Czeslawa were buried. I thought about the small wooden crucifix above the kitchen doorway that one of the founding sisters had carved by hand over 200 years ago. I could not leave them, and so I stayed. The Germans allowed us to remain under one condition, the same condition I would later learn had been applied to nuns in convents across occupied Poland. We would cook, we would clean, we would maintain the building, and we would be invisible. That last part was not stated explicitly, but it was understood. We were to be present enough to be useful and absent enough to be forgotten. We were furniture. We were the women who appeared with food and disappeared before anyone had to acknowledge our humanity. For the first 3 months, I lived in a state of constant, suffocating terror. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Every morning when I descended the stairs to the kitchen, my hands were shaking. Every time a door opened unexpectedly, my heart lurched so violently I was certain the men in the next room could hear it. I slept in a tiny room at the back of the convent that the Germans had decided was too small and too cold to bother with. And every night I lay on my narrow mattress and ran through every possible scenario in which I might be discovered, arrested, shot, or worse. Because here is what people do not understand about living in that kind of proximity to danger. It was not one dramatic moment of fear, it was 10,000 small ones. It was learning to walk softly enough that my footsteps did not echo in the corridor. It was learning which floorboards creaked and mapping a path through the building that avoided every single one of them. It was learning to keep my face completely neutral. Not blank, because blank draws attention, but neutral. Pleasantly occupied with whatever task was in front of me, as though my internal world had been swept clean of anything that could be used against me. The officers barely looked at us in the beginning. We were right that we were furniture to them. There was a captain, a man I came to think of only as the one with the dog, because he kept a large German shepherd that followed him everywhere, and he was the one who ran the administrative operations from the convent's former library. He had a wife and children somewhere in Bavaria, whose photographs he kept in a leather frame on the desk. He was not cruel in the obvious ways, but I watched him sign orders, and I understood that paperwork, too, can be a weapon. By the second month, I had developed a routine so precise it felt like choreography. I was in the kitchen by 5 in the morning, before any of the officers were awake. I prepared breakfast, set it in the dining hall, and was gone before they arrived. I moved through the building during the hours they were in their administrative sessions, cleaning the corridors and the sleeping quarters in their absence. I delivered meals, kept my eyes on the floor, and answered the few questions directed at me in the simplest possible Polish, because my German was actually quite good, and I had decided very early that pretending not to understand German was one of the most useful decisions I could make. Overhearing things I was not meant to hear became, over time, simply part of my existence. I am not going to describe the specific things I heard in that building during those 2 years, because some of them are not mine to carry into this story. But I will say that there were evenings when I returned to my small room and sat on the edge of my mattress and pressed my hands over my mouth to keep from making any sound at all, because what I had heard that day was too enormous to contain in silence, and too dangerous to express in any other way. The other three sisters who had stayed with me were my lifeline. Sister Jadwiga was 54, a former school teacher who had entered religious life late and brought with her a practicality that I found indispensable. She was the one who figured out that the Germans changed their overnight guards at 2 in the morning, leaving a 12-minute window when the eastern corridor was unwatched. Sister Magdalena was 26 and was the one most likely to crack, not from cowardice, but from rage. She had lost her brother in the initial invasion. Some nights I could hear her in the room next to mine, and the sound of her suppressed weeping was one of the loneliest sounds I have ever known. And Sister Rosalia, who was 67 and partially deaf, and who moved through the whole 2 years with a serenity that I was never entirely sure was faith or simply the mercy of not being able to hear most of what was happening around her. There was a moment in the spring of 1943 that I think about still, that I will think about until I die. One of the younger enlisted men, barely 19, sat down at the kitchen table one afternoon while I was peeling potatoes. This was a violation of the invisible boundary that had been established, the understanding that they occupied the front of the house and we occupied the back. He sat there for a long moment, not saying anything, and then he said, in German that he assumed I did not understand, that he wanted to go home. I kept peeling potatoes. I did not look up. I did not allow my face to change. But inside me, something complicated happened, because I understood exactly what he meant. Not the political desire to end the war, something smaller and more unbearable than that. He meant he wanted to sleep in a bed he recognized. He meant he wanted to hear a language spoken without fear attached to it. He meant he wanted to be a 19-year-old boy again, instead of whatever the uniform had made him. I understood every word of it, and I hated myself a little for understanding. I will not make him into a hero. He was wearing that uniform. He had chosen to put it on, or had been given no choice, and that distinction matters enormously. But it is a distinction I was not equipped to make with any certainty from a kitchen in occupied Poland. But I will say that the moment complicated me in ways I had not expected, and that complications were dangerous, and I spent a long time afterward rebuilding the clarity that I needed to survive. The closest I came to discovery was in January of 1944. One of the officers, a meticulous and suspicious man who had arrived as part of a rotation of new personnel in November, began noticing things. Small things. A door that seemed to have been recently oiled. A set of footprints in the frost of the garden that did not correspond to any of the Germans' usual routes. He was the kind of man who cataloged discrepancies the way other men collected stamps. He began watching us. I felt his attention before I could identify its source, that particular prickling awareness at the back of my neck that I had learned to trust completely. For 6 weeks, I was more careful than I had ever been. I altered my routines. I stopped using the Eastern Corridor entirely. I moved through the convent in patterns that were designed to look random and careless, the way an animal creates false trails. Sister Jadwiga noticed and adjusted her own movements accordingly, without me having to say a word. We had developed, over 14 months, a nonverbal language built entirely out of glances and silencers that was more precise than anything spoken. The suspicious officer was transferred in February. I do not know why. I never asked. I only know that the morning I saw his name absent from the duty roster, I went to the chapel and knelt on the cold stone floor and stayed there for 2 hours, not praying exactly, but existing in gratitude too vast for words. The Germans left in January of 1945. They left quickly, chaotically, in the way of men who understand that the tide has turned and do not wish to be on the wrong side of it when it does. They were there in the evening, and by the following dawn, the trucks were loaded and the courtyard was empty, and the silence that flooded back into the convent was so profound and so strange that I stood in the middle of it and did not know what to do with my own body. Sister Jadwiga found me there. She put her hand on my arm, and we stood together in the empty courtyard without speaking. And after a while, she said, quietly, "We should start with the chapel." And she was right. That was the only logical place to begin reclaiming something. It took months to make the convent feel like ours again. There were rooms I did not enter for a long time because of what I associated with them. There were sounds, the particular rumble of a heavy vehicle, a door closing too sharply, boots on stone, that sent me back into that state of cold, controlled terror for years afterward. I am not going to tell you that surviving something like that leaves you whole. It does not. It reorganizes you. It takes the person you were and returns someone slightly different in her place. Someone who knows things about silence and fear and the extraordinary, ordinary endurance of the human spirit that cannot be unknotted from her. What I want you to understand is this. I was not brave in any dramatic sense. I did not pick up a weapon. I did not lead a resistance cell. I did not make any grand gesture. What I did was remain. I stayed in my kitchen and peeled my potatoes and kept my face neutral and walked the paths that avoided the creaking floorboards. And I survived 2 years inside the belly of something that wanted people like me to disappear. And I did not disappear. There is a particular kind of courage, I think, that history does not know how to celebrate because it does not look like anything from the outside. It looks like a woman carrying a tray. It looks like a woman with her eyes on the floor. It looks, to everyone watching, like submission. But on the inside, it is the most ferocious act of will you can imagine. Staying alive, staying present, staying yourself inside a situation designed to erase you, that is its own form of resistance. I know that now. I have known it for a long time. and I carry it with me still. The knowledge that silence, when chosen deliberately, when wielded with absolute intention, is not weakness. It is the quietest kind of power there is.